Welcome to History 2020. I'm Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I just want to go ahead and apologize right now for my hair because I can't go anywhere to get my hair cut. And Solomon has offered to cut my hair for me. He's actually offered several times recently and said, "Hey, Daddy, you want me to cut your hair with my kid scissors?" And I've said no. Actually, I asked him, I said, "What, do you want a kid to cut your hair?" And he was like, "No." And I was like, "All right, well, you're a kid, me either." I'm not going to let him, but there will be a point at which it could not possibly look worse. And that hopefully will be at the end of the semester.
I love kids' electricity.
Last class, we looked at the post-war era from the perspective of the international community and on the ground in the U.S. And those have been the last two lectures. And with both of those, we've kind of paused around the early 1950s, and we've gotten to the point where the Korean War is in swing. And today we're going to pick up, and I, friends, am going to attempt to cover an entire decade of American history in this lecture. That decade is the 1950s. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different for you guys, where I'm going to pull up some of the slides because I've got some images to show you all. So I'm going to do a screen share. So last class we talked about the changes that happened after World War II, the prosperity, kind of how who's left out of that changes the country. And we've kind of been dancing around the impact of the Cold War at home and how it affects politics, and we will get through that today. I wanted to start off by showing you guys some charts that I think are really interesting. I already brought this up in the last class, and here it is. Like I talked about the tax rates, right? And again, this is on the highest earners, and you can see how the tax rates go there. As I told you before, in the years after World War II, between 1946 and about 1963, the highest tax rate was over 90%. And we talked about how that can impact things. So, you weren't paying this rate on everything you made, to be clear. Some people don't quite get this, but it's everything over that threshold. And this is the highest and the lowest earners here. So you can see how this changes. Taxes go up on everybody beginning in 1940, and that should make sense considering the war effort. And then you can see there are periods where they go up, and then you see they go down in 63, and then you guys notice a big year there. If you look, what decade is the biggest in terms of overall drop in the highest tax bracket? What decade? Anybody? When do you see the biggest drop? So you see the 1920s, right? You see the 1920s here, and then you see the 1980s, right? And the 1920s is, I think overall the most significant in a decade, and then the 80s is a huge drop after this. We're going to talk about that as we go along, but you may also notice that in the 1980s, taxes went up on the lowest earners. Now, let me be clear, tax code is insane. And the way these things play out on the ground is not always, it's not always straightforward like this. However, I think, I even brought this up before. There's this idea that if you tax people heavily, that the economy will suffer. And while I will never, ever give you guys, a conclusion about this, all I will tell you is that life demands nuance. And a true scientist asks questions and doesn't come to the table with answers already in their head. And there are times when it's a good idea to raise taxes clearly, and times when it's a bad idea to raise taxes clearly, and everything else is in between, and we have to think it through. But the assumption that people say, this is kind of like it's built into the way we talk about things, that if taxes are really high on the highest earners, that it will be terrible for the economy, that the unemployment will go up. We're like in my father's lifetime of that being the case, it being this high. And yet the 1950s were a period of massive prosperity in the U.S. Does this mean if we jack the taxes up on people right now to 90% that suddenly we get that back? Absolutely not. There's a lot of factors. But now you know that if someone says, if you raise taxes, it's going to kill the economy, you know that that isn't necessarily always true, right? It's not like vampires and garlic. You know what I'm saying? Like something that's always true. You know what I'm saying? Like mummies and Russian language. Like they hate it, right? That always, but it's not like that, all right? Totally different. It's something more nuanced. So this is all I'm saying. What I love to do in this class is try to kind of shake you guys out of some of these things we say over and over again, because as I've said, God bless you. I need your generation to save this country. We had our shot, and it's not looking like my generation's going to quite do it. God knows the World War I generation's still running the country, and now we need you guys to step up. Please save us. All right, tell your friends. So you've got this chart, and then you go over here. How many of you guys have heard people say that if the minimum wage goes up, it's going to be terrible for the economy because it will just lead to inflation. It will just, increase it. And these, this argument. Okay. So if that were the case, you would expect that periods, when minimum wage was higher, you would expect to see trouble in the economy. Here's a chart here. Now, there's the nominal minimum wage, and what that means is the actual dollars and cents, right? Like right now it's like $7.75. That's the nominal amount. But there's the real amount too, and that is actually like the value at any given time, right? So basically trying to peg the purchase power of a dollar, 2017 dollar, what would that buy you in 1950, right? That kind of thing. So here you have a chart that actually traces minimum wage, and it's got the nominal minimum wage. In other words, what the actual number is on it, and it's compared here. What's in the green is the real value, all right, adjusted for inflation in 2017. If you look at this, you will see that the minimum wage in the United States in real terms in 1968 was over $11 an hour. And for much of U.S. history, and certainly the 50s, it goes up. But basically what happens is Congress will increase the nominal value, and then there'll be inflation, so the real value will go down. And so they'll adjust the real value. And you can see that happening over time. But if you look at it, you're looking at the 50s, and you can see that by the end of that decade, they've jacked it up a lot. By the end of the 60s, it's really high. Again, these are years of economic growth and prosperity. It doesn't hold up to the idea that increasing minimum wage is going to tank the economy. It may have some detrimental aspects to it, right? It may have some effect. But that alone, again, it doesn't suggest inflation. If you actually look at in terms of inflation, the 1980s are out of control. And that isn't a period where you see the minimum wage. What do you see here? You see the value of the minimum wage actually dropping, and the nominal value holding pretty much flat throughout the decade, and yet inflation is rampant. And we'll talk about that. It starts in the 70s, actually, and how Reagan basically helps get that under control. But again, not here to give you conclusions, here to try to break you out of the assumptions that you hear people saying all over and over and over again. We've looked at this one before. This is income inequality. Basically, what percentage of the entire income goes to the top 10% of the wealthiest people, basically bringing the most money. And we've talked about that before when we talked about the 1920s. You see this right here. We talked about 1929 this year being a high point on that. And then our second, the highest year actually after that, being right here at 2008. But look at this. 1940, you go in with pretty high distance between, basically pretty high wealth consolidation. And look what happens. During World War II, it absolutely falls. And what this means is that money, income is more evenly distributed. So this is a pretty good track for a stronger middle class, at least in terms of income. You see where it goes. It drops in the 1940s. It goes back up a bit. But the 50s and then the 60s, again, these years of really, really high prosperity, you see that wealth shifts. And then you see what happens. You get to 1980, and you begin to see a peak and then a bit of a drop there with the recession, 87, the crash there. But it's gone up a lot. And you see moments where it drops back down, but it continues to go up after that. So this is another indicator that we can look at. And again, there are a lot. I'm just showing you some that I think work well together to make a good point here. And then finally, take all these charts I just showed you and compare them to the other chart that I showed you before about national debt. Remember we talked about how national debt goes up in World War II and how it really quickly begins to get paid off in these years. And if you follow this over, you can see that the debt as a percentage of GDP, which also depends on how high your GDP is, so that matters. But you can see you go across here and then you hit the 1980s and again, the debt begins to go back up. And so take all these together and you see an interesting picture here, which is that there's high tax rates that eventually, minimum wage is climbing in these years and peaks out in the 60s, that wealth is distributed fairly evenly in this period, and that in all of that, the debt is going down. And then you look at the 1980s, and 1980 is a pretty big moment. In the 1980s, you see the debt to GDP ratio go up. 1980s, you see wealth consolidation go up. In the 1980s, you see the actual real value of minimum wage go down significantly. And you see taxes dropped on the highest earners. So all that says together a lot about the 50s, 60s, and then about the 80s, which we'll get to later. Does all this make sense to you guys? I mean, are you guys seeing this? My goal here is to get your head spinning. And if this is confusing, it's because I'm just trying to get you guys to think about these things because they fascinate me. Any questions about this? Cool. Killing it. Again, something important to say, these are just this is 4 sets of data, okay? There's a lot more. If you're interested in this, dig in further, okay? So there we go. Now, boom. Which one of you guys is a communist? Which one? Which one? Which one? Molly, your brother? He's a communist? All right. I won't call the law on him because he's too young, but once he gets to be 16, we'll send him to the communist juvie camps. You know what I'm saying? The ones where they smoke cigarettes and play basketball. Wait, that sounds awesome. Never mind. Just kidding. No, communists.
What's a communist?
What's a communist? That sounds like something a communist would ask right there. Well, that's actually a fantastic question. Because what is a communist? On several occasions, I saw a buddy of mine's dad. I used to work for him at a driving range. Great dude, fought in Vietnam War. Hardcore American dude, right? I watched that guy on multiple occasions get mad because his 1930s Ford tractor wouldn't start, and he threw an American-made Craftsman wrench at it and called it a communist. I saw another Vietnam veteran, good friend of mine's dad. These are all people that I love, so I'm laughing along with them. I saw him working on his 1968 Chevrolet Stepside, awesome truck, man. Trying to get in something there, and also couldn't get it to work. Called it a communist. So I'm pretty sure Ford tractor from the 30s and a Chevrolet truck from the 60s, neither have ever been members of the Communist Party, probably never even read any communist literature, much less propose, a communist state. That's a good question. Let's see this.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist. If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist. But there are other communists who don't show their real faces, who work more silently
By the early 1950s, Communist Party membership had declined considerably, but Cold War propaganda inflated its threat to fantastic proportions. An evil so pervasive that the whole society had to be mobilized to combat it.
May Day brings a wave of anti-communist sentiment as 100,000 march down New York's Fifth Avenue in a loyalty parade. Everyone from vets to youngsters reveals his inborn dislike of communism. A united answer to those menacing our country's liberty.
Sergeant, check the kitchen. You look in the back. I'll be upstairs. Hey!
What is this? Where do you think you're going?
We have no time for explanations. Already we are 15 minutes behind schedule.
I don't care who sent your why. You're not going to take another step until I see your warrant.
Warrant? We need no warrant. As a member of the Young Communist League, your daughter has volunteered for farm work. She's to be transported immediately. The truck is waiting outside.
You say my daughter volunteered?
That is correct. Here is her signature. Requesting transport to the People's Collective.
Signature on that piece of paper is false. And everything you've said is a lie because my daughter would never leave here of her own free will.
Sergeant!
You've got no right to be in this house. I'm going to give you just 10 seconds to get out of here.
Daddy? It's true, Daddy. I did volunteer for farm work.
Linda, why?
The party convinced me that I should free myself of the lingering bourgeois influence of family life. I am ready. Do not interfere. It is for my own good.
And Comrade Donovan, do not think that your deviationist remarks shall be overlooked. It will be reported to the proper authorities.
Frightening, isn't it?
I love it. I love the way, like, if he reads Communist Party newspaper, he might be a communist. It's like the Jeff Foxworthy of the 1950s. He's like, if the red on your flag is redder than the red on your neck, you might be a communist. And it's just so insane, man. Oh, so there you go. Does that help? Does that help you understand who a communist is?
No.
Okay, exactly. It doesn't. So that's the thing, though. Who is a communist? Now, there's like communists, like by theory, right? There are people that like embrace it, but this is the problem, right? So let's get back to this guy, Joe McCarthy. All right. I told you guys about how quickly things turned around with, from World War II. Soviets are expanding. They expand through Eastern Europe. You have what's going on in Germany with the Soviets refusing to leave there. China, North Korea. And back home, as I said before, people are looking at Truman saying, you're just letting this happen. And so people begin to criticize, and particularly the Republicans begin to criticize the Democrats, which have been holding on to power for a long time, basically since that 1932 election. And one of the big accusations is, you're soft on communism. Sorry. So here's the issue. And this is what's fascinating. You guys remember how the Soviets got the secrets for the bomb? Espionage. There were people inside the Manhattan Project that were sending information to them. No question they were Soviet spies in there. But do you think Truman tried to let that happen? I mean, a lot of the complaint of the Republicans against Truman and the Democrats was they weren't hard enough on communists. They let us lose Korea. They let us lose China. And so being aware that there were communist spies, or Soviet spies would be the best way to say it, Soviet spies inside of the Manhattan Project. And then suddenly there's an awareness that a lot of them, at least some of them, are working in the federal government. This opens up fertile territory for a little bit of what we might call a witch hunt. Now, the important thing to remember about a witch hunt is that for it to be a witch hunt as we use it, there can't be a witch there. All right. Sometimes I hear people being like, this is the witch hunt. And it's like, well, we saw you do it. And they're like, no, I didn't. It's like, empty your pockets. And they stole your milk duds. But at this time, what ends up happening, and this is why it's so fascinating, this Red Scare that happens is all about searching out these communists, right? It results from the fear of understanding what had happened inside. But it gets bigger than that. And it actually takes place and becomes very politicized. So this guy named Joseph McCarthy. Have you guys heard of McCarthy? Okay, Joe McCarthy was the junior senator from the state of Wisconsin. And in February of 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy says he has a list of 205 known communists working in the State Department. And people are like, what? Where did you get this list of 205 people? And he's like, don't worry about it. And they're like, can we see it? And he's like, but if I see it, they'll know. They'll know that I know who they are, so you cannot see it. And they're like, but they're really communist, right? And he's like, oh yeah, they're really communist. So like, I'm going to keep it a secret. I mean, I'm telling everybody, but I'm not going to let you guys know who's on the list. I'll handle this. The thing is, you got to believe in me. Go after anybody that I'm after. This goes down, right? And it actually is put in the context of the Republican Party, which had been pushed out of power since 1932. It becomes a tool for them to seize back some power. And so there's a lot of legitimate criticism of Truman. As I said, I call him a bonehead, right? That's the only person on the earth that I use that word to refer to. I don't know why, but actually I think I do know why. I explained it last lecture. There's plenty of concern over discovering that there were spies in the Manhattan Project. There's plenty of concern over knowing that there are some people that are affiliated with the Communist Party in the federal government. But this guy's like, yeah, but what if we said a lot of people we don't like are communists? Over time, this guy's list gets longer and longer, and he whips up a lot of fear. And there is the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was started in the 1930s to basically investigate any type of activity. It was originally started like for those who were sympathetic to the Nazis. It becomes a courtroom, essentially like a place to put people on trial and destroy their reputations. And people know what's going on. It's kind of terrifying because McCarthy's just calling everybody a communist. Anybody who gets in his way. And people who know that this is wrong are a little bit worried to say anything because this guy has so much fear whipped up. And it's not just him. People buy into it. This is the thing. We call it McCarthyism because he was the leader, but just like every other movement of fear, there's a lot of people backing it. He begins to accuse a lot of people, and it starts to become clear that this guy is kind of, drunk with power. In this period, I don't know. I'm bummed out because I really wanted to find a good documentary on McCarthyism to give to you guys. A new one just came out in January from PBS American Experience, but it's not available anywhere without paying for it. And again, we know, don't ask students to pay for things at a time whenever everyone's we're already dealing with it. So he basically, to summarize, McCarthy whips people up into fear. A lot of people's lives get ruined. A lot of people get blacklisted for not actually doing things that they were accused of doing. And I think the lesson to me that I walk away with when I look at McCarthy is there really was an issue. There really were people that were in our State Department. There really were people in the federal government that had some association with the Soviet government. And that, which should have been the focus, gets turned into a weapon for people to exercise their political interests. And I don't know, it always concerns me like that because it's like in the meantime, you're distracting from what actually needs to be done so that you can carry out your agenda. So just, be careful about that stuff, man. People get riled up. By 1954, people had realized that McCarthy has no evidence, by and large. The party turns against him. Edward R. Murrow. Has anyone here seen Good Night and Good Luck? It's got George Clooney. It was like an indie film, maybe like 10 years ago. It's so good. It's about Edward R. Murrow, basically how he's able to use his credibility to eventually kind of work around McCarthy. But this guy, let's just say this. 1950, he has that list of 205 known communists. By 1957, he's dead, probably from alcoholism. It seemed that maybe he was hearing some voices. So I don't know. It concerns me. It's obviously something that we keep doing over and over again. I mean, I'm not saying we're doing it right now. I'm just saying that, people get scared and they act, and keep your head about you. In the middle of all this, there's a presidential election. And this is when Dwight Eisenhower runs for president. You guys heard of Dwight Eisenhower? I like Ike. You heard of that guy? Hero of World War II. First Supreme Commander of NATO in 1951. He was the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces. He was in charge of D-Day. I mean, a decorated officer. The interesting thing about 1952 is the Democrats are kind of on a downslide. People want Eisenhower to run to be president, but no one actually knows what party he's in because he's never announced it. He's like, I'm a military man. Like, I follow orders, right? I'm not being partisan. And that's pretty amazing, honestly. But both parties wanted him to run, and he ended up going with the Republicans, like less than a year before he ends up running for president for the Republicans. He's like, I'm a Republican. Harry Truman backed him. Harry Truman, who was a Democrat, was like, yeah, definitely vote for that guy. And people were like, what'd you say? He was like, yeah, I would vote for him. And so Eisenhower comes in, and kind of in the middle of this high partisanship, he manages to accomplish a lot. And he wins in a landslide. You can see here, if you look at this map from 1952, the South keeping it real by and large, sticking with the Democrats no matter what, except for Tennessee, God bless them, Virginia, down there, and, Missouri. Oh, they think they just think they're in the South. We'll let them. Of course, Missouri from the South, right? But you can see this. He wins in a huge victory here. And he immediately, during his campaign, before he takes office, he goes to Korea to oversee what's going on there. And eventually he's able to bring the war to a ceasefire. And then the war ends in. Anybody know when the war ends? Oh, let me tell you, this is a trick question. All right, this is a trick question. First of all, it was never a war because Congress never declared it. So not a war. Second of all, ceasefire, 1953. Still going, guys. You guys know that we're still locked in conflict with them. Oh man. You guys want to see some more Koreans marching? Look at them march. Just kidding. We don't have to do that again. We're gonna do it again. Let's do it. So fast forward to when this launches, there's going to be Koreans in here. Anyway, one of my friends was like, how'd you fit all those Koreans in your house? And I was like, dude, they can march. So you have him, he comes in, and he's going to change a lot. Now, one of the important things to know about Eisenhower that is really interesting for what his effectiveness is that the Democrats work with him. Like, there is a general sense of respect for Eisenhower that few other presidents have in the 20th century because of partisanship. So he's able to get a lot of things done. And he's got a really interesting legacy when you compare his, domestic legacy to his international legacy. I'll just explain this here. Right here, real quick, is a chart of parties. You can see that there is this moment, right, where you see the Republicans, right? They take two houses of Congress there in that 48 election. The 46 election right there. But then down here, you can see that with Eisenhower, for this blip here, this 1 minute, the Republicans from 1953 to 1955 actually control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So whatever you want to say about McCarthy, I guess he had made something work, but also Eisenhower being so popular mattered. So you can see it's pretty close after that. The Democrats are going to take back over shortly thereafter. I'll pause right now. Do you guys like having these things up here better, or do you like it when it's just me? What's your preference? Anybody?
I like pulling the slides, honestly.
Okay, cool. Everybody else like the slides? Awesome. Cool. Good deal. It helps me keep focused too. Anyway, this is good. We did that live comedy game show Friday night, and it was a blast. But we did it just like this, and it worked. So Or at least we're doing it again Friday, so I guess it worked well enough. Anyway, all right, so Sawyer, you're back. Okay, cool. So let's talk about foreign policy first. Eisenhower brings in these two really significant figures that are going to reshape American foreign policy. The first is John Foster Dulles, who is his Secretary of State. And the other one is Allen Dulles, who is his head of the CIA. Anybody notice anything similar about John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles? Anybody notice anything about them? Anybody notice anything? Yeah, they're brothers. So they're brothers. And they become really the architects of his foreign policy. And a big part of this is shifting the way that the U.S. deals with the Soviet Union and other communist states. So whereas Truman, remember, you read the article about Truman, kind of the summary of Truman, where Truman believes in like hard-nosed threats, military advances. He believes in like a right and wrong, and you're not going to back off, like that kind of thing that leads him into, honestly, isn't really that effective. Eisenhower, the military guy, comes in and changes the way that policy is going to work. He no longer is going to angle for some type of a direct confrontation. In fact, he's going to work to smooth things over kind of on the face of it between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, because with the help of the Dulles brothers, Eisenhower's foreign policy is going to be a lot about pretending like nothing's happening and using the CIA to do what you want to get done. And this is going to lead us into some pretty unfortunate periods in American history, or like moments in American history, I'll say. So, on the one hand, no nuclear war happens, right? I mean, we're kind of building up towards that, right? I mean, remember in Korea, MacArthur was just like, Douglas MacArthur telling Truman, like, let's just nuke them, dude. You don't get that with Eisenhower as much. So what you do have is like some pretty significant coups that are going to change the trajectory of people's lives and the history of other countries. 1953, you have the Iranian coup. This is interesting because basically Iran is not, they're not claiming allegiance to either the U.S. or the Soviet Union. What they're doing is they're kind of playing between it, but the U.S. begins to think that maybe Iran is getting closer with the Soviet Union. But the big issue is that, like so many countries in the world, Iran has immense natural resources that are owned and controlled by foreign companies, which means that the country itself is losing a ton of the resources it could be using to industrialize, modernize, invest in education. So you essentially have a guy named Mossadegh who comes in charge, and the people of Iran are pushing for the nationalization of oil fields that are owned by British oil companies. MI6 in the UK really experienced that using the state levers of power to ensure financial resources and investments abroad. But by this point, they don't think they have the manpower to do it. They don't think they have the ability to basically bring down this government. So they communicate with the U.S. Through Kermit Roosevelt, relative of the Roosevelts we were talking about before. And they concoct a plan basically to see to it that this guy is brought down. In his place, they prop up the Shah of Iran. And this guy rules with an iron fist between 1953 when this happens and 1979 when basically he's overthrown and the Iranian Revolution and the Ayatollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran are established. This is, I don't even know what to say about this. I mean, this is the kind of thing that sounds like a conspiracy, doesn't it? I mean, when you hear about it, you're like, sounds like, you want to know why? Because it is a conspiracy. That is what a conspiracy is. It's not a conspiracy theory. It is a conspiracy that is well documented. In fact, for a long time, this evidence about these things gets covered up, right? You want to keep a lid on it. You want to deny it, keep information out, even if people kind of know it happened. And people knew it happened, right? But the evidence wasn't there. So for a long time, people had been trying to get evidence. The CIA wouldn't release it. But through other means, a lot of the information had come out to where it was clear that the Dulles brothers had engineered this. But the last thing that was kind of unclear was how much Eisenhower knew about it. How involved was Eisenhower? Was this something that was done behind his back? Was this something that he had given a nod to but stayed out of? Well, it wasn't clear. But a lot of historians, because Eisenhower was in a lot of ways such a great president, a lot of people kind of were like, yeah, he probably didn't know exactly what was going on. And that was the common assumption until 2017. And we actually spoke with an author who wrote a biography of Eisenhower that came out in early 2018. And I asked her about this. I said, how did this affect you? Because like your book was done and then this evidence got dumped. Like your book was about to be published. Like did it change the way you saw things? And she was like, absolutely. The big change was these documents made clear that not only did Eisenhower know about it and support it, Eisenhower was following it in the White House like minute by minute, getting updates on it. And to this point, a lot of the evidence had confirmed what we thought, but now this totally changes the way we understand Eisenhower, right? Because we knew that he was in on it and we knew that he was following it closely. This is the way history evolved. Because sometimes people are like, you're trying to rewrite history. It's like, well, yeah, somebody wrote it the first time. I just figured sometimes things could be better. But also, it's like, yeah, it's not rewriting history. There's lots of ways that things change, and one of them is that evidence comes out. Like, for example, you guys remember Mount Jerry? That wasn't even available in 2013. I think that came out in 2014, right? So like, these are the new things. Now, that didn't really change the way we thought about Harding. It just kind of made some funny lines. But evidence is released. People are constantly filing freedom of information requests. Freedom of information requests to get access to this information. And so as this stuff comes out, we learn about it. Sometimes it can change the way we understand the past. And so it seems to me that if you know more, then you add that to the history books. It's why it's important to keep up on things. People, when the last history class they took was like in high school and they're 60, it's like, well, we found out some things since then, buddy. Like, it's not that a lot of years of stuff is wrong, but we found out some more things, but people feel threatened by it. It's not a threat. It's that we're growing as we learn more. Another case of using the CIA to overthrow a regime was in Guatemala in 1954. I won't say a lot about that here because for this week, I don't know if you saw, but the readings are up now for the rest of the week. For this week, the readings are all about that. There are 3 pretty short readings, but overall there's one that is just an overview, and then there are 2 readings that are from different angles. One is actually an unclassified report by the CIA about what happened in Guatemala. So like this, this wasn't available and it's recently been declassified. So you can read what the CIA says about it. And then another account by a historian named Jorge Gonzalez writing about what it was like on the ground. So, you'll get that there. But in summary, basically we use psychological warfare through the CIA to convince Guatemala that it was being invaded so that the president who was threatening to appropriate American land, or American businesses' land, would flee and he could be replaced by someone that would continue to support the ownership of that land. It's shocking how, not even trying to hide it they were about it. They tried to hide the coup, but that United Fruit Company. Remember United Fruit Company? You guys remember them? You guys remember them? They were bringing bananas and stuff, and we were like, what, banana? And and now they essentially are pushing U.S. foreign policy. Not totally, but they have influence. Also, watch for it when we get to the Bay of Pigs, and watch for it when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Actually, watch for it when we get to the... Actually, watch for it when we get to the Bay of Pigs and see if any of the characters on this screen are still working in the Kennedy administration. Moving forward. So you get... moving forward. But on the ground, under Eisenhower, the 50s are a pretty interesting time. Remember how I told you that like McCarthy is after everybody for possibly being a communist? Well, in the 1950s, because one does not want to be accused of being a communist, and a lot of people are, very strongly for the American system, and you could understand why. I mean, as communism is not exactly appreciative of freedom of religion. It's a very different system, right? I mean, whether or not it's a good or bad thing is one thing, but whether or not shoving that system on top of people that have a totally different way of life is, whether or not that's a good idea. Probably not shoving it on top of people, and people are very worried about it. Whether or not they need it to be is another question, but But one of the ways that you show that you're loyal in the 50s, you just like watch movies like from the 1950s or set in the 1950s, and like every dude has like short hair, and like girls are dressed with like they all have like certain hairstyles. Like it's very, I mean, not that we don't now, but it's very like crisp, very clear cut type of being and expectation. This is related to the Red Scare. This is related to the militarization of American society, as some people have called it. That you behave in very clear ways. You fit in certain boxes, and that shows that you are not trying to question the norms. It shows that you fit in. It shows that you are part of society. And it's very ironic to me that that to be a nation of individuals, everyone decided they needed to prove that they did not have the individuality that would mark them as a communist. But that's just me. Also, always made me confused whenever people in my church growing up would be like, hey, guys can't have long hair. And I'd be like, that picture of Jesus, he has long hair. And they'd be like, don't you talk about Jesus like that. And I'd be like, what? I didn't say. And they'd be like, boy, you know how it goes. Anyway, so in these years, women begin to marry younger, and new types of opportunities, typists and things like this, open up for them as the economy booms. And this is something that's interesting. Look at this chart over here. Do you guys see this chart? Bring this over here about the age of marriage. This is fascinating. Look at this. So it stays up here. It drops down. It goes up in the Depression. You can see 1890 here, right? The 1890s is, you're getting into an era of depression, right? You have the 1893 crisis. And then you go to 1940. It's gone up. And then you go to 1950. Look at this. Boom. Drops. Anybody want to guess like why it would drop?
Partially because of the Red Scare, the communist hunt, and maybe all the people coming back from World War II.
People coming back from World War II. Excellent. Right? Prosperity. Who got the GI Bill by and large? Who was it? Was it women? No. I mean, women were eligible for it. I mean, some women were able to get it, but the same blocks hit them, right? Like there were a lot of universities that didn't allow males to go. I mean, didn't allow females, right? So you have social mores, against women in college. So they're fighting a lot of the same things then too. But almost all the benefits of the GI Bills go to young men who come back, and now they've got benefits. Now they've got wealth. It is way easier to get married when you have money. Now that's not to say you have to, all right? And you could just go to the courthouse, all right? You could just go to the courthouse. I think it's like $50. You could be married right now, but it's usually easier to manage everything when you have a little bit of money and resources. So that's part of it. Another part of it has to do with like the creation of the idea of the nuclear family. This image that's projected, we'll talk about later in the next lecture about television, right? So you have the image projected to people. I also really am interested in knowing here, and I don't know this, right? Because you'd have to get into the qualitative stuff. But a lot of women married men who were going off to fight in World War II, right? And as I may have mentioned in a previous lecture, my grandma married a guy who was leaving to go fight. And he came back and she was like, oh, sorry. Kind of didn't think I'd see you again. I wonder how much like people having those marriages affected it. I don't know that it did, but I'm just interested in knowing this because, we're looking from 40 to 50. That might have brought the average down. But But yeah, you're seeing this, and women go into this home life. I love this woman right here. She's so happy. I mean, she's like, hey, look, a washing machine. Hey, look, a baby. And I'm like, are you going to throw that baby in that washing machine? And she's like, no. And I was like, but you were going to, weren't you? And she's like, yeah, totally. Why wash the baby and the clothes separate when this modern marvel right here could scrub them both? And I'm like, because you don't shake the baby. And that's a lesson you will learn if you ever go to baby lessons, which you have to go to before they'll give you. They don't have to, but you should. And they will tell you over and over again not to shake it. What they don't tell you is that babies love to be shaked. All right. That's something they never even tell you. And side note, Solomon watches this TV show. It's like kid songs. And like one of them is called Peanut Butter in a Cup. And it's like a chant. And they go, peanut butter in a cup. We sing this song to pump us up. Bang, bang, choo, choo, train. Come on, Sally, do your thing. And I like singing it to him. Peanut butter in a cup. We shake this boy to wake him up, and he doesn't like that. And anyway, so that was a side note. He's like, we don't shake me. I'm like, all right, fine. But you see this image, right? You see women who are typists, right? You're still talking about women in the workforce, but a lot of it's part-time. And the economy after World War II, oh my God. Let me repeat. The New Deal did not bring an end to the Depression. World War II brought an end to the Depression. Let me also repeat. The economy booming after World War II did not mean that people's lives were going to improve. Me and 100 people, if our GDP per capita, $1 million each, that means we got $100 million in here. That's great. You'd think, right? But if I've got all the money and they've got zero, that average is based upon them having nothing. How good is it doing the people with no money that I have $100 million? Not much, unless I'm pretty cool about it, you know? But it doesn't mean anything. But there are these mechanisms, right? The GI Bill, which helps people have opportunities, which moves wealth down. The minimum wage, you have retirement. I mean, just so many things that are built into this that allow for it to go down. And this boom between 1945 and 1960, the gross national product grows by 250%. That's nuts. But there's this fantastic thing that happens in the 1950s. It's called the interstate. Have you guys ever heard of the interstate before? Have you ever heard of it? Do you know what it does? Where does it go? That's right, between states. It's a huge infrastructure development program. You guys like Waffle House? Thank Eisenhower. All right. You don't ever see a Waffle House like in a strip mall. You never see that. You see a Waffle House where? On the interstate. Absolutely. Also, where do you pick up hitchhikers? Where would hitchhikers even catch a ride if it weren't for the interstate? So, hitchhikers watching. I don't know. I guess you're waiting. Anyway, thank Eisenhower. This interstate has so many more implications for American life than you guys probably have ever even contemplated. First of all, the suburb. You're already seeing people move out of downtowns and cities, and this accelerates it. Why? Because you're still at a point where you have to have some type of resources to have a car. So if you have a car, you can live outside of town for a little bit. You're not relying upon the public transit. And now you can live in your little suburb outside of the city with your little green lawn and your own house. Get out of that downtown area. And now what ends up happening is downtowns begin to fall apart, and the center of congregation ceases to be the downtown main street, and it moves to the, anybody know? Anybody know? Where'd you guys get dropped off to be cool when you were in middle school? That's right, a drug dealer's house. Just kidding. Where did you go? You went to the mall. Did you guys not go to the mall? By the way, that was a test when I was like a drug dealer's house, and you guys all were like, and I was like, very good. That's excellent. That's how I catch you communists, all right? So, you guys didn't go to the mall? You guys didn't go to Opry Mills and go to a movie with your friends? No? This is sad. Some people are like, no. Did you want to? You did, but you didn't get to go? No? What? Nobody wanted you there? That's sad. We've got one student here who's just really sad about it. He's crying now. Oh no, he's left the room. This is terrible. Chase him. Don't chase him. I don't want to talk. But yeah, And this is like something interesting for your generation. Have you guys seen a bunch of empty malls lately? Just dying malls? Yeah. Think about this. What happened in the 1990s in terms of cities? What happened was eventually everybody got cars and traffic got terrible. And people started moving back into the cities they had abandoned. And when they did that, the malls that relied upon middle-class people in the suburbs began to close as people began moving into the city, which was only accelerated by Amazon. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Not just Amazon, but all online shopping. The interstate changes where people live. The interstate system is a federal project that is used to actually tear down parts of cities that are deemed undesirable by local politicians. Let's see if I can explain this well. Have you guys ever considered that the reason they started building the interstates in the 1950s was related to the atomic bomb? You guys ever thought about that? That's weird, isn't it? But it was totally part of the plan for the interstates. It was related because with an atomic bomb, foreign countries were assumed to be targeting major cities. If they did that, they would try to hit the central part where all the business and the infrastructure and the factories are, right? The infrastructure. So moving into a suburb gets you out of the center of the bullseye, just far enough away just to grow a couple extra arms and lurch around the rest of your life. But that's a big part of it. Moving out is a part of strategy. The interstates were built also, and is a big part of it, for evacuations. Evacuations in the case of an attack, to have main lines for people to get out. And 1 out of every 5 miles, I believe it is, in the interstate is also, and this system has to be straight. Has to be one straight mile. Anybody know why? Colin, you know why. You don't know why? Oh, I thought you would. It has to do with flights. So that every so many miles, there has to be a straight mile in case there needs to be an emergency landing or in case you need to airlift in or out of a city supplies. So the interstate changes where people live, changes where people shop. It leaves behind the downtown area. People with money get out. You guys know how we refer to, like, when you hear people say inner city, what's that mean? Poor, right? I mean, it's just a phrase, inner city. It means poor. That's a phrase of this time because the people who were left behind in the inner city by the 70s generally are people who didn't have the resources to get out and get a newer house in the suburbs. So inner city was literally the part of the middle of the city that they didn't leave to move to the suburbs, and that was a poor area. That phrase pops up. Never considered that, like, just a geographic designation about a city had so much to do with this, but it does. On top of that, think about this. You guys know anything about, like, classic cars? You guys know anything about it? Consider this. You ever looked at, like, a car from the 1950s or early 1960s? Most of them. What do they look like?
Big and boxy.
Gigantic. Right. Absolutely gigantic. Some of them with, like, wings coming off of them and everything, right? Heavy as can be. Huge motors. But have you ever been in one of those cars? Is it, like, mega fast? No, because it weighs a lot. And people just wanted these bigger and bigger cars. But they didn't go particularly fast. You want to know why? Because there just wasn't that much use in your average American's life that they would want a production vehicle that could go very fast. Consider this. Have any of you guys ever gone from Murfreesboro up to Nashville on Murfreesboro Pike?
I've gone from Franklin up to Nashville, just using back roads on Franklin Road.
Okay. How fast do you get going between those two places?
It varies from 45 to 50.
Exactly. Are you ever like, dang, dude, man, I wish I'd crank this thing up to 100 miles per hour? No. Because there's just not much of an opportunity or a need to go particularly fast. So there's no really incentive for a production vehicle that is really fast. Here's what's fascinating. In 57, you get the Corvette, right? And it is like a more generally produced sports car. But what's the first mass-produced sports car, really? A car that's made to go fast, that's lighter, all of that. You guys know what it is? the Ford Mustang. 64 and a half. Ford introduces the Mustang, which is built on the chassis of a Ford Falcon, which was the smallest car that Ford made at the time. I used to have a 64 Ford Falcon. That was the one that was built on. 6-cylinder engine, 2-speed Ford-O-Matic. The only 2 speeds were go and go more, but not a whole lot more. And it got terrible gas mileage, and it was an inline 6 that had, like, I'm sure it had great torque, but it did not move. So they build the Mustang on that. It's a bit lighter. They put the 289 in it. It's fast as can be. 64 is when that happens, and then later on you get the Camaro and all that. That has a lot to do with the interstate. Because why would an average person want to buy a car that goes fast when the fastest they can go when they're going places is like 60 miles per hour? But suddenly you build interstates, which are wide roads that go long stretches without lights, and having a car that will go fast is actually more of a benefit than it is just, a perk. So this changes the way cars are made. The interstates change. It's amazing. On top of this, in 1948, even before this, Congress approved the 30-year mortgage. By 1960, 1/3 of Americans live in suburbs. And the booming economy and high taxes help finance it. And as crazy as it is, when you look at this, we know a lot about poverty, and we know that there's still a lot of poverty, but the gap between the rich and poor falls in this era. We'll talk about the Lewis Woods article a bit here, but you've read it. Basically, actually, I'm not even going to include this in the lecture, but you guys signed that for today. We've talked a lot about this. It's been a running theme. I've wanted to back it up in different ways, but yeah. So I just want to show you guys now. We talked about redlining before, in the segregated by design. You've read for this week Lewis Woods' piece, which talks about that. I just want to wrap up by bringing this home. Here's a map of Nashville. This is actually the redlining map they used to determine where people could and could not buy homes, right? Now, to put this in context, there were 4 categories that the FHA would use to designate an area, right? And remember, this has everything to do with whether or not you can get a loan. Even if you live in an area and you have tons of money, they won't give you a loan on something that's not in an area that their experts have deemed to be desirable. Check this out. What parts are green the best? Are you guys familiar with Nashville? Okay, so down here is basically Green Hills, right? So this is the area now that still is a very affluent area. You then look at the B, the kind of the purple area, still desirable. This around here, around Vanderbilt, right? So this is Vanderbilt and Belmont and all of that area right here. Then you look at where's another area that is in the still desirable or good. Most of Nashville isn't. The other area up here, Inglewood. All right, so Inglewood is north of East Nashville. Okay, so that's still be desirable. But almost the entire portion of the city we see here is either definitely declining and majority is deemed as hazardous. This, by the way, just to show you guys, I live right here. Where is this here? This is this before my neighborhood was built? Where is going around here? Yeah, right up here basically. This is where I live. So I live in an area kind of between it. But this, if you guys have been to Nashville, you can see this, right? A lot of the way this map is laid out still actually works. The exception here being East Nashville, which has been gentrified. A lot of that had to do with the Nashville tornado that came through several years ago. But look, this area up here, this is the area around Tennessee State, around Fisk. These areas over here, you go down across the city, you can still see today the way this affects things. And just wanted to bring this home for you guys. All right, guys, have a great night. Cheers. No questions, but definitely a comment. Dr. Sawyer is going the way of Tom Hanks in Castaway. And there's confirmation from everyone else. Math checks out. I would just like to say all I see is that you guys think that I'm a lot like Tom Hanks. So thank you very much for that comment. Because I will say that that I did used to get told a lot that I look like Rick from Walking Dead. And people were like, well, that's a compliment. That guy's handsome. And I'm like, no. They didn't say I look like the actor who plays Rick in Walking Dead. They said I look like Rick in The Walking Dead. And that is a very different thing.